In 1915, the British government was in crisis. It was argued that there was a shell scandal and that the British troops on the front lines in France didn't have the firepower they needed to win the war. In fact, it was reported, leaked to the Times newspaper, that the lack of high explosive was a fatal bar to British success. This brought down the Liberal government, who were forced into a wartime coalition with Labour and the Conservatives. The first thing the coalition did was start making the vital munitions they needed to win. One of the places they did this was at HMF Gretna, on the border between England and Scotland.
HM Gretna is now a mothballed base, and you can't get in thanks to these 8-foot-high fences topped with barbed wire. But just beyond this and through the thicket of trees, you can still see the buildings that stretch across 9 miles where the potent devil's porridge would have been made.
The explosive they made was a relatively new concoction called Cordite, a chemical substance so powerful that it would replace gunpowder. It was dangerous to produce as it involved combining nitroglycerin with gun cotton that had been exposed to nitric and sulfuric acid. This mixture was aptly named the Devil's Porridge, due to its innocuous look but its lethal impact.
The factory was laid down by the government in 1915 and was ready rapidly by 1916. It spanned over 9 miles and had 30,000 people working on site at any given time. They worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, making the vital munitions that could go to the front line and help Britain win the war. HM Gretna was known as the greatest factory on earth, but it wasn't so great for the women who worked here, was it?
No, their lives were quite strictly controlled. The majority of them were aged 16 to 20, which is why they were known at the time as the Gretna Girls. The state was heavily involved in every aspect of HM Factory Gretna. It was run by the Ministry of Munitions, and the government saw themselves as the parents to these girls, and they wanted to look after them and protect them physically, but also protect their morals, and that meant controlling and limiting their behaviour. This is one of the first times that young women would have had freedom, away from home, money in their pockets, places to go to spend it, dances to go to, pubs they can visit, and the state just wanted to limit that and make sure that the girls were good girls and looked after as such.
It sounds like they were concerned with the safety of their morals, but they weren't particularly concerned with the safety of their physical health. The conditions they worked in were pretty dire.
Yes, absolutely. There seems to have been more concern maybe with the moral side of it than with the health and safety side of it by today's standards. This is what we would call a porridge pot. And as you can see on this picture here, they seem to be mixing this with their hands.
So the gun cotton comes in, is put into big mixing bowls like this with different acids and liquids that they were breathing in that was soaking into their skin. It's poisoning their liver and it's sending them yellow.
The main side effects of that were intense headaches when people came in contact with the fumes. They developed a hacking cough. They could get addicted to the scent of the fumes as well. We know of girls who lost fingers, who lost arms, and we know of several young women who lost their lives as a result of working in the factory through fire or through explosion.
So we think of all of the maiming, the terrible injury and the trauma of the First World War, and we associate with that with the men on the front line.
Yeah.
But actually, you come back to the UK, to Scotland, to England, and it's happening right here.
Absolutely.
You've got people who are being poisoned by the chemicals that they're using, and they're undergoing some of the most horrifying physical injuries.
The war didn't just happen in some faraway country, it happened right here. And it didn't just affect the men on the battlefield, it affected everyone. Not just because the women who were left behind had emotional ties to the soldiers at the front, and obviously there were widows who worked here and people who lost sons and things like that as well, but because the women actually experienced disfigurement and ailments and loss of life and loss of limb as a result of their war work as well.
Behind me is the original hospital built here in Gretna for the factory workers. And some of the cases you had here were acid burns to the arms, severe acid to the eyes and the face, and respiratory conditions that would last a lifetime. In fact, during the course of the war, you had 700 factory workers who were admitted here. The trouble is that conditions that they had were those that you'd more likely to find on the front line, but instead they were here, on the home front in the United Kingdom. Anna, your Auntie Marion actually worked at the factory.
She did, yes. She went there as a young girl, about 17, I think. She worked there for 2 years, and she died at 23 from her chest problems.
So she was healthy beforehand, went
Sporty,
into
yeah,
sporty
very
as well,
sporty, yeah.
went into the factory and died at 23.
Yeah. From what I can gather, she must have been in one of the nastier parts of the factory, in among the ether plant or something like that. Nobody knows for sure because it was a war effort and they were doing their bit for the war. It's very difficult to get people to tell you about anything in those days. My mother's friend, Aunt Nan, she used to say, well, I worked for the government.
Yeah.
And we were busy,
Yeah.
but we had a great time at the dances. And that was sort of a standard reply. There was 2 or 3 ladies that I knew that had been in there, and they all said exactly the same thing. So whether they were told to say that.
Because there was a lot of propaganda around this
Yes, there
as
was.
well.
Yeah.
You know, the young girl smiling, working in the porridge pots, when for all intents and purposes it was less to smile about.
Yes, nobody talked about what went on in there. But when I was old enough to go to work, I can always remember my mother saying, you'll not go into that place down there, which was the factory. You're not ever going to work in there.
As if the Gretna girls didn't have a hard enough life at the factory, when they came home and went to socialise, that was policed as well. You had the local police force that was located here, and you also had a dedicated women's police force, which enforced the social and moral fabric of society. They would be there watching and waiting at the dances, also at the cinema as well, even at the train station, seeing who they were fraternising with and making sure they weren't spies.
On their way into work, they would be searched for contraband, whether cigarettes or matches. The women police would make sure that they weren't carrying in anything that they shouldn't be. So they're not only interested in the security of the factory, the women's police, but they were there to make sure that the women didn't step out of line on a moral basis. They'd make sure that the women didn't get too close to members of the opposite sex, because that wouldn't have done. They were sort of looked upon as a sort of middle-class brigade, a sort of Nazi sort of regime that made sure that the women didn't step out of line.
Originally, the women's police force were only there to look after them when they went into the factory and search them. But then they realised these girls weren't going to stay in the one place and they would go out and enjoy themselves. So then the women police force were out. I mean, when you got to the railway station, they were there going up and down to make sure everybody was behaving. And
So it started off, the women's police force, they were to make sure that they were well behaved in their accommodation in the hostels, along with their matrons as well. But then as the war went on, this became a kind of more social policing. They policed their morals and their relationships from the train station through to the dance halls and the cinemas. We know that the Gretna girls enjoyed the social side of factory life. In fact, it was one of the few perks of working there. At this cinema behind me, which was purpose-built for them, they'll be able to watch all the latest films. But even these were censored at the highest levels. Anything too romantic or love stories were removed from the billing. They didn't want the girls to get any idealistic notions of love and marriage. Instead, they wanted them to keep their head on the important war work.
There was a bit of a moral panic about the girls, whether or not that was legitimate concern that they were being degraded as a result of their contact with it, or whether it was just a perception of those in authority that young women with too much freedom are of course going to get up to trouble. They're bound to fall into bad ways, and that would then lead to criticism of the whole project. So if the girls were misbehaving, then the project would be perceived as having failed, and the people behind the factory were desperate to prove that this scheme could work. and that they could act as parents to these girls, and that girls could be trusted in these positions.
And the people behind the factory were men?
Yes, they were, yeah. Wealthy, well-educated men who we might label elite.
Do we know what happened to the girls after the war? You know, did they go and continue work in factories? Were they able to find work after that?
One of the things that people credit women working during the war with is women achieving suffrage in 1918, or some women achieving suffrage in 1918 in the Representation of the People's Act. One of the ironies is that the women who worked here, who did all that, suffered all that, convinced people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that they were deserving of the vote.
Yeah.
They would not be the women who received the vote in 1918, despite the fact that they were arguably the ones who won it. They were too young, they were not landowners or property owners, and the majority of them were not married. So although the working class women here had done so much, they actually didn't benefit from the suffrage movement when it came.
So even though these women put in the sacrifice, they were deemed too poor and too young to be able to vote in the political system.
Yes, they won the vote, but they didn't gain the vote.
In 1915, Britain was in crisis, and it was the women of the UK who answered their nation's call. For some, it was in part a positive experience. They were afforded more freedom than they had had in their entire lives. But for others, their lives were cut short, maimed or injured in the factory work. These people's lives have been neglected from the official records, and their sacrifice hasn't been recognised. The least we can do now is remember the impact that they've had on our collective histories.